Hi, my name is Kevin Burmeister. I've been involved with the City of David for the last 15 years, working on the eastern slope of Mount Moriah. I've worked with 4 or 5 different archaeologists at that time, and the information, the news that we have over here is very exciting. The questions that we have to ask ourselves as a result of all of this is, what was King David seeking on the lower slopes of Mount Moriah? After all, for 7 years he was king in Hebron. He abandoned his kingdom to conquer a Jebusite fortress on the lower slopes of Mount Moriah, where he moved his kingdom. And only much later, at the end of his reign, did he become interested in the Temple Mount, the summit of Mount Moriah, which at the beginning was open territory. He could have easily conquered that, but he did not. He chose to stay on the lower slopes. And the question we're asking ourselves is why? Now, the evolution of Mount Moriah starts here back in the period 2000 through 1500 before the Common Era, about 3,800, 3,500 years ago. What we do know, very rare, is that a central site like this has almost no archaeology on the summit of Mount Moriah and on the ridge of the lower slope of Mount Moriah. The only archaeology we find here is on the eastern slope, around the Gihon Spring, the water source coming out of the mountain, and in the valley floor. Very little else. By the time we get to Joshua, the period of Joshua, we find that the city is developing on the top of the ridge. We find that the water system is being protected and a citadel has been built, and we see the city continuing to develop. By the time King David comes along or is established, he builds a more substantial wall around the city, improves the defenses, improves the citadel around the water source for processing and bringing water into the city every day. Builds his palace in the city, but still, for all of his kingdom, leaves the Temple Mount unoccupied. By the time we get to Uzziah, through Hezekiah, the later kings, Judean kings, we see that the mountain is fully developed, the palace, the temple has been built by Solomon, of course, and we see the water system, the tunnels that Hezekiah or Uzziah built through this mountain, cut through and deliver water into the Shiloach at the bottom of the mountain, which is the main pool that is used for servicing the needs of the city. This is the sort of modern Mount Moriah in this square. We can see the Shiloach at the bottom, fed by the tunnel system underneath the ground, the Gihon spring feeding that water system from the valley floor of the Kidron Valley. On the western side, we see the Pilgrim's Road, which is presently being excavated underground and very soon will be opened to the public, and we can see how substantial that was during the period of the Herodian temple, just before the destruction of the second temple in Jerusalem. Our interest here is on the eastern side, this inset, which is a stone cut temple, a temple cut into the bedrock, and with several very unique and key features, including a raised platform for building and constructing an altar, a liquids channel for blood, water, and wine, an olive oil press for the pressing of pure olive oil, a matzeva, which is a standing stone to make a covenant with God, grain press, and a place for slaughtering and processing animals. Now, here we see elements that we've just spoken about. Interesting to note is that the place to tether animals, to tie animals, is very low. That means that these animals were small animals, which is consistent with Jewish law. Animals under 1 year old, typically without any blemishes, or the younger they are, without any, the more likely they have no blemishes, and therefore the best of the stock are the ones that were brought up for sacrifice. The matzeva, which was erected, it's not a gravestone, there's no bodies buried here. This is a stone that was anointed with oil to make a covenant with God. This is the press that was used to press oil into this well. The raised platform, here you can see the raised platform. Note that this room, when it was carved out from the bedrock, the instructions were to leave the platform as it is, and we can see that in place today. Now, the most telling information that we have of this temple, the dating is from this water system that serviced room 5 and room 1. So water would pour into room 1 to clean the room, and into room 5 it was a gravity-sourced water system that would flush water into these rooms to clean the rooms after use from slaughtering animals and sacrificing animals. Here we see the result of samples that were taken from the water channel, and in the pipe, the plaster pipe that was set in the bedrock, we find these organic samples. Now, Cambridge University and Wiseman extracted those samples, and the samples W and V, which are closest to the plaster, and sample X, which is closest underneath the plaster, give a date range within 10 years, as has been defined by Wiseman, of 1525 through 1555, or 1555 through 1525 before the Common Era. So 3,500 years ago, roughly. And we find that date range is curiously interesting to us because the chronological dating for the Bible indicates a very similar range for the period Jacob's last 30 years in Canaan or Israel. And we can see 1545 exactly when Joseph was sold. 1553 fits within this lower date here for the construction. That's when Benjamin was born. That's after Jacob spent 21 or 22 years out, 20 years outside of Israel, came back to Israel, eventually arrived at Beit El, set up a matzeva, which is the matzeva that he had previously set, having had the stairway to heaven dream, the famous dream of Jacob. This is where Jacob ultimately came back to build Bethel, that he had promised to build God before he left Israel, before he had a wife and a family, or wives and family. And he returns here 20 years later, laden with cattle and wives and kids, and he begins to build Beit El. He sets the matzeva and he takes the name Israel. God gives him the name Israel at this location. Now, the context of dating is essential for us, and it begins to really confirm this location as the location of Jacob, the location of Isaac, the location of Abram, his grandfather before him. Now, Ronnie Reich, who is the lead archaeologist together with Eli Shukran, made a statement recently that he declared that Ein Shemesh, the Gihon spring, which is in the valley floor over here, is really called Ein Shemesh in the Bible, and Ein Shemesh means the sun spring, and the sun comes from the east and shines into the spring every morning to this very day. That's what it does. He draws the boundaries from the book of Joshua, indicate that the line of the boundary between Benjamin in this area and Judah outside of the boundary were drawn to Ein Shemesh, from Ein Shemesh up down to Ein Rochel, along the Geba Hinnom and up the western flank towards the valley of Rephaim. Now, the famous commentator Rashi brings that the southeast corner of the Mizbeach, of the altar, had to be within the territory of Judah, and the other three corners had to be in the territory of Benjamin. Now we can see that the boundaries fit this image, that the southeast border coming from Ein Shemesh going to Ein Rogel could easily capture the southeast corner of the altar, leaving this section to the territory of Judah and this section to the territory of Benjamin. We can also see that this is the westernmost wall of the altar, and that therefore whoever was servicing this altar had their backs to the sun, facing the west, which is very unusual for other installations around Israel, which are idol worship installations that turn to face the east, face the sun. Most of the idol gods were honoring the sun, but Abram turned his back to the sun, and the Jewish tradition is away from the sun. So we can see how the Mount Moriah has evolved, but what we now know from the discoveries in the water channel and around the water channel is that the samples that have survived all these 3,500 years only survived because the area was completely buried. By the time King David arrived in the city, dirt had fallen down the mountain, buried this entire installation, and that because those samples have survived, we believe that King David never ever discovered this, that we are the first people to discover this in 2,700 years, in thousands of years, 3,500 years, but for a short period of time during Hezekiah and Uzziah, this installation, there was a wall built over this installation. They discovered it and they reburied it, and they reburied the matzeva in soft sand and preserved it for a later generation. Here we are today, having discovered it, and we are very excited about it. We are really scratching our heads trying to make out exactly what this was, who it was used by, the dates that it was used, but it presents some conflicts with the temple that was later built by Solomon on the Temple Mount. The story of King David, who set a an altar up on the summit on the Temple Mount, who acquired the Temple Mount from the king of the Jebusites under the guidance of the prophet Gad, and did so because of an erroneous count, because of a plague that had killed 70,000 Israelites in the north of Israel, and because of the threats of that continuing plague to Jerusalem. David repented, and he bought this site on the top of the mountain from the Jebusite king, together with the other tribes who in their pandemonium were united to buy this location. And David ultimately set that as the place for the altar of Israel. Whether or not that altar site that David set as the altar of Israel was in fact Akedah, the site that Isaac was offered by his father Abram, remains a question, and we'll keep on looking. Thanks for listening, and keep watching for more news.